My name is Claire. I'm 42. Last week, someone sent me a podcast link. I wasn't going to click it, but curiosity wins sometimes. There he was, my ex-husband, laughing, smooth as ever, telling some host how I'd lost my grip after the divorce, called me vindictive, claimed I made up stories to stay relevant. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just sat there, listening to the same lie he'd spun for years, and realizing he still believed it had worked. Before I dive into my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like and the subscribe button. I met Jason when I was 24. I had just finished my master's in early childhood education, and he was managing a marketing team at a mid-sized firm downtown. He was charming in a way that made you feel like you were the only one in the room, even when it was crowded. He had this unshakable confidence, a magnetism that pulled people toward him, including me. Things moved quickly, too quickly. In hindsight, we were engaged within 9 months, and married less than a year after we met. At the time, it felt like a whirlwind romance, fast, exciting, passionate. I didn't see the warning signs for what they were. The first time he interrupted me mid-sentence and laughed about how intense I could be, I brushed it off. When he forgot to show up to my graduation dinner and told me I should have reminded him again, I told myself he was just busy. I wanted to believe love meant grace, and I was determined to give it. We settled into our home, a modest 2-story just outside the city. I decorated every inch of it with soft tones and careful planning. He brought in gadgets and noise. It became a strange dance between order and chaos, but I adapted. I always adapted. When we had our first child, a daughter named Emily, everything shifted. I became the planner, the worrier, the one with schedules and color-coded fridge calendars. Jason floated in and out of responsibility. He'd hold Emily when it made for a good photo. He'd tell stories about fatherhood at work while I stayed up nursing a colicky baby and reading articles on postpartum anxiety in the dim light of our bathroom. I didn't mind being the responsible one. What I couldn't stomach was the way he'd turn it against me. You always have to be in control, he'd say, tossing his keys on the counter after staying out late with friends. You make everything a task. Just relax. When I asked him to pick up formula or attend Emily's pediatric checkups, he'd shrugged, joke that I was the real parent, or say he didn't want to step on my system. It was always my system, never our child. At first, I thought we were just different, maybe opposites attracted. But when I gave birth to our son, Nathan, and Jason left halfway through the hospital stay to take a business call, something cracked. I remember holding that tiny baby in my arms, stitched and exhausted, while he paced outside telling someone about his big week and how he was killing it. He came back with a smoothie for himself and a compliment about how I still looked pretty good for someone who just popped out a baby. I think that was the first time I truly went quiet around him. As the kids grew, so did the contrast between our parenting. I'd enforce bedtime routines, structure screen time, and show up for every school event. Jason would promise ice cream on Tuesdays, forget to pick them up from soccer practice, and still get hugs and laughter when he walked through the door. He became the fun one. I became the nag, the wet blanket, the uptight one. But it was more than that. He started telling stories to friends, little anecdotes that cast me as controlling. He'd roll his eyes when I asked him to check the kids' homework, say things like, "Claire runs this house like a military base," with a laugh that sounded affectionate, but wasn't, and people started believing him. Friends we'd known for years stopped looking me in the eye. His coworkers would give me these strange smiles, like they felt sorry for him. My own sister once asked if I thought maybe I was too intense, a phrase I'd come to loathe. I began to keep notes, not because I wanted ammunition, but because I needed to stay grounded. When someone gaslights you, not in one big explosion but in slow, steady erosion, you start to lose your grip on truth. It started with a notebook, then files on my computer, texts he'd send after storming out of the house, voicemails left during drunken rants, screenshots of conversations where he admitted he'd let me be the bad guy if it kept the peace with the kids. I shared some of it with a therapist. She listened quietly, then told me something I never forgot. "You're not crazy, Claire. You're organized in the face of chaos. That's not control. That's survival." I clung to that sentence like a raft, because by then, I had stopped expecting fairness from Jason. What I wanted was to stay sane for the children. Still, I didn't leave. The thought of tearing their world apart was unbearable. And, truthfully, a part of me still hoped he might come around. that we could fix it, that maybe if I tried harder, or softened more, or stepped back, he'd meet me halfway. Instead, he weaponized the distance. He'd sigh dramatically when I reminded him of a dentist appointment. He'd scoff when I suggested a joint decision. He told friends I didn't believe in fun and once joked at a dinner party that Claire married the kids and just lets me stay here. It wasn't just disrespect, it was erasure. And when I finally started making more money than him, when I got promoted to assistant director at the early education nonprofit I worked for, I saw it in his eyes. Not pride, not happiness, just a quiet, simmering resentment. The more I succeeded, the more invisible I became at home. He stopped asking about my day, stopped acknowledging anniversaries, would cancel date nights with vague excuses. And then, worse, he started telling the kids things I never said, twisting my rules into meanness, my structure into control. I found out he told Emily once that Mom doesn't want us to have fun because she's jealous. She was 6. By the time our son turned 10, I had stopped sharing anything personal with Jason. Not dreams, not worries, not even memories. He wasn't a partner anymore. He was a co-tenant with a talent for looking like the better parent from the outside. I stayed for the kids. I told myself they needed stability, and maybe they did. But looking back now, I think they also needed a version of me that wasn't slowly disappearing. Because by then, Jason wasn't just hurting me. He was preparing the world to believe I deserved it. It was a Thursday. I remember because I always booked my therapy sessions on Thursdays midweek, just enough time to process and recalibrate before the weekend. That particular session had been quiet. I didn't cry. I didn't have any major breakthroughs. I just talked about the numbness. How everything at home felt like cardboard, functional, flat, and dry. My therapist asked if I still believed I was holding the family together. I said I didn't know anymore. I got home around 4 in the afternoon. The driveway was empty, which was strange. Jason's car was usually there by then, and the kids would be making noise in the kitchen or sprawled across the living room with half-done homework. But the house was still, not quiet like peace, quiet like absence. I walked inside and felt it before I saw it. The coat rack by the stairs was half empty. The hooks that usually held the kids' backpacks were bare. The basket of mismatched shoes, gone. At first, I thought maybe they had gone on an impromptu outing. But the refrigerator told another story. Half the snacks were gone. My Tupperware containers, the ones I always packed for the kids, were missing too. Their toothbrushes had vanished from the upstairs bathroom. I stood in Emily's room and stared at the bed. The sheets were gone. The stuffed bunny she couldn't sleep without, not there. That's when it hit me. He'd taken them. There was no note, no call, no warning, just absence. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jason. A single line, giving you some space. They'll be with me for a while. It's better this way. I don't remember sitting down, but at some point, I was on the hallway floor, back pressed against the cold wall, staring at the message like it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. I tried calling him straight to voicemail. I texted, "Where are they? What's going on?" No response. By the end of the day, I realized something worse than silence had begun. He wasn't just leaving. He was rewriting the story, and he was doing it fast. That night, I logged into Facebook and saw a photo. Jason with Emily and Nathan at the zoo, smiling. The caption read, "Sometimes all they need is a safe place." My heart didn't break. It dissolved. Over the next 48 hours, the real damage began. Emails from our mutual friends stopped. Group chats went silent. Even my sister, who used to call me every other day, suddenly needed space. I checked my inbox and saw nothing but red receipts. He was telling people something, and, whatever it was, they believed it enough to vanish without a question. By Monday, a court summons arrived. He had filed an emergency custody request. In the documents, he claimed I was unstable, emotionally erratic, and unfit to care for the children. He referenced my therapy sessions, said I had confessed dark thoughts, which was a gross misrepresentation of the safe, vulnerable things I'd said in sessions meant for healing. He included cherry-picked journal entries, ones I had confided in him about during our hardest months. He even mentioned my short stint on medication after Nathan was born, twisting it into evidence that I couldn't parent without risk. When I showed up in court, he brought a lawyer I'd never met. I stood there, disoriented, and watched as he painted me as someone I didn't recognize, calmly, persuasively, like he'd practiced. I wasn't allowed to speak freely, Just answer what was asked. My voice sounded shaky, and I hated that. I could feel the judgment in the room before I said a word. He handed over screenshots of old texts, clipped journal pages, and vague testimonies from people who hadn't visited our home in months. The judge ordered temporary supervised visits for me, because I needed evaluation. I left the courthouse not angry, not yet, just hollow. There's a specific kind of pain that comes when someone who once held your hand uses your softest moments as weapons. That was what this was. He didn't just want space, he wanted to erase me. The children didn't know the full story. Jason had already begun shaping their version. He told them I was taking time for myself, that I needed a break. He fed them candy-coated lies that sounded like love, and that terrified me more than anything else. He posted more photos, more captions, doing our best, step by step, they're healing. And people believed him. Or at least they didn't ask questions. No one asked me anything. I tried to reach out. I tried to explain. But anything I said sounded defensive, panicked, unstable, exactly the image he had painted of me. I could feel it happening in real time, the loss of credibility, the social unraveling. And there was no press conference to correct it. No hotline to dial and say, "This isn't true. Please ask me what really happened." So I did the only thing I could do. I started gathering. I pulled every email, every voicemail, every calendar event. I went back through years of texts. I looked for patterns, dates where he'd admitted fault, messages where he told me to take the blame because it would be easier. I saved screenshots of friends defending him, echoing things he must have fed them. I backed everything up on a USB drive and locked it in a box under my bed. I contacted a digital forensic analyst, someone who could verify metadata on files, timestamps on deleted messages, trace IP addresses on social posts. It wasn't cheap, but it gave me a sense of ground under my feet again. I was tired of playing defense in a war I never wanted. I kept going to therapy, kept breathing, kept showing up for the supervised visits even when the kids looked confused and distant, unsure whether I was still the real mom or just some strange woman who cried to isolate. Through it all, I stayed quiet publicly. I didn't argue with his narrative online. I didn't post photos or counter-explain to mutual friends. I knew that kind of noise would only feed into his portrayal of me as erratic and unstable. But every time I left one of those visits, every time I watched him smile as the kids walked away, I reminded myself, this wasn't just about custody. This was about identity, and he was trying to burn mine down while pretending to be the firefighter. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't happen in one screaming match or slammed door. It was in the quiet theft of who I was, a mother, a partner, a woman with a voice, rewritten as an unstable ghost who'd simply checked out. But I wasn't gone. I was watching, recording, building. And one day, I would have my voice back, not by begging to be believed, but by proving what he thought he'd buried. There's one day I revisit often in my mind, not because it was loud or explosive, but because it was the moment something subtle inside me shifted. It was the day Nathan was born, our second child. I was 32, and I had planned everything. The hospital bag had been packed for weeks. I had printed a checklist, laminated it even, with everything Jason was supposed to bring, down to the brand of granola bars I liked during labor. I'd sent him articles about supporting your partner in childbirth. Not because I didn't trust him, I just didn't want to leave anything to chance. I went into labor early that morning, around 4:30. I shook Jason awake, breathless and already timing contractions. He groaned, rolled over, and muttered, "It's probably false labor. Just wait a bit." I didn't. I called my sister, and she drove me to the hospital. Jason showed up 2 hours later, still buttoning his shirt in the hallway, smelling faintly of last night's whiskey. He hadn't packed the bag. He hadn't read the notes. He didn't remember where my ID was or the birth plan I'd printed. But still, when the nurse asked if we were ready, he smiled, put his arm around me, and said, "We've got this." He took photos, held my hand once the pushing began, stood next to me just long enough for the delivery to end before stepping out to make a call. The nurse had to ask him twice to return for skin-to-skin time. He came back 20 minutes later, holding a smoothie for himself, and said, "You look pretty good for someone who just went to war." I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. At the baby shower a week later, the one my coworkers threw for us after Nathan's arrival, Jason gave a toast. He talked about how proud he was of me, how hard it must have been, how strong I was, and then, somehow, he made it about him. He told a story about how overwhelmed he'd been, how he'd had to dig deep as a father. Everyone clapped. A few people patted him on the back. I just smiled, quiet. That's how it always was with him. He knew how to perform the part of the doting husband, the involved dad. He was excellent at gestures, at image. But the labor wasn't just physical for me, it was emotional. It was mine, and I went through most of it alone. But that's not the memory that sits heaviest, the one that still burns, years later, happened shortly after Emily turned 7. She caught the flu that winter, the kind that leaves kids limp and burning up with fever. For 3 days, I barely slept. I sat beside her bed with a cold cloth, tracked her temperature every few hours, took notes for the doctor. Jason stayed in the guest room to avoid catching it, as he said. On the 3rd night, I sat in the dark holding Emily's hand, her breathing shallow, her skin burning. I whispered to her to stay with me, that we'd get through it. I remember brushing back her damp hair, heart pounding. By morning, her fever finally broke, and I nearly collapsed from the relief. Jason walked in around 9, holding coffee. "You look terrible," he joked, then kissed me on the forehead and asked if I wanted him to take over for a bit. I nodded, grateful. Later that day, I heard him on the phone with one of his colleagues. "Man, I'm wrecked," he said laughing. "Haven't slept in 3 nights. Been up with our daughter. You know how it is when you're the only one who keeps it together." I stood in the hallway, frozen. That was when it cracked. Not because of the lie, I'd gotten used to that, but because of how easily it came out of his mouth. The performance wasn't even for me anymore. It was for the world. I remember journaling that week, the words pouring out faster than I could think. "If I disappear, who will remember the truth?" That sentence stayed with me for years. Not out of paranoia, but out of a growing awareness that truth, especially the quiet, private kind, can be erased if no one is keeping record. From that week onward, I began backing up my phone regularly. Photos, messages, audio memos. I encrypted files, uploaded copies to a private cloud, printed a few screenshots and locked them in an envelope inside a file cabinet labeled Taxes 2013. It wasn't revenge. It was survival. I didn't think I'd need it someday in court. I didn't think I'd be labeled unstable or accused of abandoning my own children. I just knew that reality was fragile in Jason's hands, and I didn't want to wake up one day with no evidence that I had tried, that I had shown up, that I had stayed when it was easier to leave. These memories aren't just wounds, they're markers. Proof that I had known what was happening long before it exploded, that I wasn't blind, just too tired, too bound by hope, too careful with the pieces of my family to pull them apart. When people asked why I didn't leave sooner, I never had a satisfying answer. Because they didn't see the small betrayals, the quiet thefts of meaning. They saw smiles in photos, holiday cards, Jason giving toasts. They didn't see me at 3 a.m. reading articles on RSV while Jason snored in the other room. They didn't see the medicine schedules I wrote by hand, the conferences I juggled alone. The nights I stood outside the bathroom door listening to my daughter cry because Dad said I was being dramatic like Mom. That's why the flashbacks matter. Not because they explain everything, but because they show that the betrayal didn't begin the day Jason took the kids. It began, long before, in the way he told my story back to the world with himself as the lead, and I let him, for a long time, because I believed in family. I believed in trying. I believed that being silent and steady would count for something. It didn't. Not to him, but to me. Those memories are now evidence, not just of pain, but of presence. That I was there, fully, painfully, lovingly there, and the moment I realized he intended to erase that, that's when I stopped just surviving, and started preparing. It took almost a full year before I filed for custody reevaluation. I didn't rush it. I didn't act out of impulse or anger. I waited, and while I waited, Jason got sloppy. Maybe he thought he had already won. Maybe he thought I'd stay quiet forever. But power built on image alone has a short lifespan, especially when the truth has receipts. By that point, I had gathered everything. I had digital backups of every voicemail, every manipulative text. I had the photos he staged online, the captions that contradicted court statements, and screenshots from group chats where he bragged, not directly, but enough to see the pattern. I even had a timeline with timestamps, when he posted something about me, when I lost a friend, when a new accusation showed up in court. But the real shift came when I found the fake email. It was a random Tuesday evening. I was sorting through older messages, trying to trace a suspicious thread my lawyer had flagged. And there it was, an account with my name, slightly misspelled. The tone was familiar, but the language wasn't mine. It was condescending, harsh, self-sabotaging. This fake Claire had messaged our daughter's school, subtly implying she was overwhelmed and not mentally equipped to co-parent. The email had a date, a domain, and metadata. That night, I made 2 calls, one to my lawyer, one to the same digital analyst I'd hired months ago. By the following week, we had enough to move forward. The court scheduled a new hearing and ordered a deposition. Jason showed up confident, new haircut, expensive watch, the same charming smirk I used to fall for. I stayed composed. I wore a plain navy dress and didn't speak unless asked. During the deposition, my lawyer presented everything methodically. He didn't dramatize, just laid it out, piece by piece. First, the metadata from the fake email. IP addresses matched Jason's home network. Device signature matched his laptop. Time of creation coincided with the day he had claimed to be traveling. Except his phone's location history placed him at home. Jason tried to brush it off at first, said I was digging too deep, called it paranoia. But when the second email came up, one to his podcast manager with talking points that referenced court details not available to the public, his expression changed. Not fear, not guilt, just calculation. Like someone realizing a plan was slipping. The judge didn't say much in the moment, but you could feel the shift in the room. There's a weight that settles when silence tells more than argument ever could. Then came the recordings. Voice notes Jason had left on shared devices, snippets of conversation between him and a friend. Joking that Claire's gonna snap eventually, just gotta keep pushing the right buttons. Another where he said, even if she figures it out, no one's gonna believe her. I've already written the story. He didn't deny the voice. He didn't even try. The judge called a recess. 2 weeks later, the order came in. Jason's shared custody was suspended. He would need to complete a psychological evaluation and court-mandated counseling before he could resume unsupervised visits. For the first time since this all began, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Validation, not joy, not vengeance, just the quiet internal shift of being seen clearly again. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post anything. I didn't call the friends who had ghosted me to say, I told you so. Instead, I went home, opened my journal, and wrote. It wasn't my voice that saved me. It was my silence, documented. The following weeks were strange, not lighter, exactly, just less distorted. The kids were cautious at first, especially Nathan. He'd been told so many versions of me, it was hard to know which one to trust. But I didn't push. I showed up. Consistently, kindly, I answered their questions with honesty, but without bitterness. Jason's podcast paused indefinitely, no official statement. No grand unraveling, just silence. And the silence spoke more than any apology ever could. One night, a few months after the court ruling, I was tucking Emily into bed. She was 10 by then, old enough to sense the unspoken weight in a room. She looked at me, eyes serious, and asked, Mom, did you always know? I paused. I could have said yes. I could have listed every red flag, every subtle betrayal, every moment I should have walked sooner. But instead, I said, I knew who I was, even when others didn't. She nodded like that made sense. Maybe it did. That moment stayed with me. Because that was the heart of it all. Not the custody battle. Not the fake emails. Not even the social erasure. The real war had always been over identity. Over who gets to tell the story. Jason tried to claim that power by narrating mine for me. But truth doesn't disappear just because it goes quiet. It waits. It holds its shape. And eventually, it finds the light again. Quiet justice isn't loud, it doesn't storm into rooms or slam doors, it gathers, it listens, it remembers, and when the time comes, it speaks with receipts, not rage. I don't believe in revenge. Not anymore, but I do believe in records, in timelines, in facts, in the kind of resilience that doesn't need applause, just accuracy. I didn't move away after everything settled. I thought about it, a fresh start in a new city. A place where I didn't have to run into old friends who had gone quiet or see familiar doorways where I once waited for Jason to come home with something resembling love. But I stayed. Not because I had to, but because I realized I didn't need to leave to start over. What I needed was to reclaim my space. And slowly, I did. The house felt different. I rearranged the living room furniture. Not dramatically, just enough to feel like my own decisions again. I replaced the art on the wall. took down the photo of our old beach vacation that had once felt like a family memory and hung up a watercolor Emily had painted instead. It was messy, vibrant, alive. I kept going to therapy. Not to fix myself, I had already done the heavy lifting. I went to remember how to live without waiting to be doubted. The kids came back slowly. At first, it was one weekend. Then a week. Then school breaks. There was no grand reunion, no tearful apology. Just ordinary moments, brushing hair, packing, lunches, listening to Nathan rant about his math teacher. Trust didn't rebuild with words. It rebuilt in the quiet, repeated acts of showing up. Emily asked me once why I never corrected what people said about me online. I told her because truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to stay whole. She nodded, the way kids do, when they don't quite understand yet, but file it away for later. There was a day, months after the final ruling, when I found myself walking past that coffee shop, the one where Jason used to hold court with his friends, sipping lattes while spinning his versions of our life. I remember passing by the window and looking in, half expecting to see him laughing, leaning back, gesturing as if telling another clever story. But it was empty. I didn't feel anger, just distance. Like passing a street from a childhood you barely remember. The kind of place that once held weight, but now just is. My therapist called it emotional sovereignty. The ability to be in your own narrative without reacting to every challenge of it. I liked that phrase. It felt earned. Jason never posted about the ruling. His podcast stayed quiet. 6 months of silence. No new episodes. No explanations. Eventually, I stopped checking. One evening, as I was tidying up old folders on my computer, I hovered over the archive I had once guarded so fiercely, the audio files, the screenshots, the annotated timeline of everything he had done. I opened the folder, stared at its contents for a while, and then quietly, deliberately deleted it. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I didn't need the proof anymore. I knew who I was. I had always known. That was enough. Now, I had spent so much of my life trying to be undeniable, as a wife, a mother, a woman with thoughts worth listening to. I kept records, receipts, journals, not to win anything, but to make sure I didn't vanish inside someone else's story. And now, standing in my own space, with my own peace, I finally understood. I didn't need to be undeniable anymore. I just needed to be true. The story ends not with fireworks, not with some dramatic twist, but with a drawing. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. Rain tapped gently against the kitchen window. Nathan sat at the table with a pack of markers, humming to himself. Emily was curled up on the couch reading. The dog was snoring somewhere near the heater. Nathan slid a paper across the table to me without saying anything. It was a drawing of me. Stick figure arms, messy hair, a big smile. Next to me were 2 smaller figures, him and Emily. Underneath, in blocky letters, he'd written, "Mom is strong." I stared at it for a long time. Not because of the compliment, though it touched something deep, but because of the certainty in his words. He wasn't asking, he wasn't guessing, he knew, and for the first time in a very long time, I smiled, not from relief, not from victory, but from stillness. The truth was no longer something I had to prove. It had grown into the air around me, into the rhythm of our days, into the quiet safety of a home rebuilt with intention. It lived in the way I folded laundry, the way I made dinner without checking my phone for fallout, the way I slept through the night without rehearsing arguments in my head. It lived in me, and that, more than anything else, was the freedom I never knew I was fighting for.